George Harrison never yelled or got mad. He almost never got angry in interviews. But when he was in the Beatles, he kept a quiet anger that got worse over time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't something everyone could see, but it was real, and it hurt him personally. Under his calm, peaceful look and spiritual interests was anger that never really went away. The quiet kid who felt left out. Back in the early 1960s, George Harrison was just a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They shared guitar chords, traded music records, and became friends because they both loved skiffle and rock and roll music. McCartney was older, smarter, and more bold. George was quiet and easy to influence, so he liked Paul's confidence and later liked John Lennon's brilliance too. When he joined Lennon's band, The Quarrymen, in 1958, he was only 15 years old. Lennon first thought he was too young to be in the band. McCartney had to set up a second tryout on a bus where Georgie impressed John by playing the main guitar part from a song called Raunchy. That moment opened the door to what would become the most famous band in history. But even from the very beginning, George Harrison was walking into someone else's story. Lennon and McCartney controlled the band's early identity. They were the main songwriters. They made the plans. George followed along. He learned. Hesso ached it all up. And for a while, that was enough for him. As the Beatles became super famous, Harrison got the nickname The Quiet Beatle. Part of it was because newspapers made his shyness seem romantic. But to people who knew him well, it was something heavier, a man who was starting to feel pushed aside, even smothered. He had musical ideas. He had spiritual awakenings. But in the recording studio, his voice was too often drowned out. When Hessig did songs, they were ignored. When he offered guitar ideas, they were questioned. Paul, especially, always wanting things perfect, had a way of taking over everything. George would later say, "He ruined me as a guitar player, not because he was mean, but from years off being quietly put down." The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just in charge. It was like a kingdom inside a band. George wasn't just left out. He was left behind. And as the group got bigger, the frustration inside him started to get harder. What had started as looking up to them slowly turned into anger. And no one made that fire burn more than Paul McCartney. The breaking point in the studio. By the time the Beatles started working on the White Album in 1968, George Harrison was no longer happy with being the silent helper. He had grown as a songwriter, both in confidence and wanting to do bigger things. But inside the studio, things were getting more and more tense. The way they worked together had changed. Paul McCartney, driven and obsessed with details, had taken a leadership role that wasn't official. John Lennon, often distracted by his new relationship with Yoko Ono, was getting more unpredictable. And George, he was done being overlooked. The recording sessions for Let It Be in early 1969 showed the cracks that had been building for years. Cameras rolled as the band tried to practice, but what they captured was less working together and more quiet falling apart. One famous moment between George and Paul was caught on tape. Paul was trying to tell Harrison what guitar part to play on the song Two of Us. Frustrated, George fought back with a calm but sharp line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It wasn't being sarcastic. It was giving up, a quiet surrender that said, "I'm not here to fight you, boo team, tired of this." To people watching from outside, it may have seemed like a small disagreement, but to those in the room, it was the end result of years of artistic suffocation. Engineer Glyn Johns, who saw Let It Be sessions with his own eyes, later said the atmosphere was very unpleasant. The creative process had become a battlefield, and George, no longer willing to hold back his frustration, temporarily quit the band in January 10, 1969. What made it worse was that Paul didn't seem to understand how serious what he was doing was. He wasn't mean, just controlling. McCartney had a vision, and he wanted everyone to follow it, even if it meant running over their ideas. George had finally reached his breaking point. After coming back to the band a few days later under new agreements, he started working on songs like Something and Here Comes Thiessen, masterpieces that proved what heck'll do when he was simply left alone. But the damage wasn't fixed. The split between George and Paul had grown into something more permanent. And while George may have returned to the band, a part of him had already moved on when friendship turned cold. The Beatles officially broke up in 1970. But for George Harrison, the split wasn't just about work. It was deeply personal. While the newspapers focused on the fight between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Harrison was quietly cutting his own emotional ties, especially with Paul. The public saw polite interviews and fake reunions, but behind the scenes, George was struggling to let go of danger that had been building for years. In 1971, Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album filled with songs that had been rejected or pushed aside during his time with the Beatles. It was a creative and money-making success, and it didn't get noticed by his former bandmates. One song in particular, Wah Wah, stood out. On the surface, it sounded happy, but words were biting. The title was a way to describe the emotional noise and frustration George went through, and many interpreted the song as a thinly hidden jab at Paul McCartney's bossy behavior during their final years as a group. The bitterness didn't stop there. In 1973, Harrison released Sue Me Sue W's, another pointed comment, this time about the legal battles that followed the breakup. While the song talked about the group as a whole, it was clear that much of his frustration was aimed at McCartney, who had started the lawsuit to end the Beatles' bussiness partnership. That move, while necessary, felt like betrayal to Harrison. Not just because he off-the-court drama, but because it made clear how far apart they had grown. Even Harrison's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, later said that George never truly liked Paul's personality. She described how George would come home from recording sessions filled with anger, overwhelmed by the constant arguments, especially with Paul. They put up with each other, she said, but I don't think they really loved each other. Professionally, they made brief attempts to work together again. In 1994, the surviving Beatles got back together for the anthology project, but even then, old habits came back. George still found Paul difficult. In private, he would roll his eyes at McCartney's suggestions, and Paul, always diplomat in public, admitted they still got on each other's nerves. Time had passed, but the wounds hadn't really healed. A guitar silenced. By themed 1970s, George Harrison had already built a successful solo career, but scars from his Beatles years still hurt, especially when it came to Paul McCartney. In a 1975 radio interview with Alan Freeman, George spoke honestly about something few had heard him admit out loud. I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul. Harrowined me as a guitar player. It was a devastating statement, quiet but sharp, coming from a man respected for his guitar work on songs like Something and Will Me Guitar Gently Weeps. The comment showed how psychologically damaging those years under McCartney's influence had been. George wasn't saying Paul had done it on purpose. What he meant was that the years of being overshadowed, second-guessed, and micromanaged had drained him of creative confidence. He'd spent too much time playing what some O'Neills wanted, and too little time buying hard on his own terms. This internal conflict didn't just affect his playing, it affected how he viewed working with others. In the same period, George confessed he would gladly join a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. Paul is a fine bass player, he said, but a bit overpowering at times. That wasn't an insult. It was the reality of working with someone whose perfectionism often meant control. For Harrison, this wasn't just music. It was about space, about being allowed to grow, and inside the Beatles there had been very little space left for him. That realization, painful and quiet, followed long after the applause had faded. Lennon the wound that never closed, while George Harrison's frustrations with Paul McCartney were more visible. His relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complicated and in many ways more painful. In the early years of the Beatles, Harrison looked up to Lennon. John was older, sharp-witted, and fearless. George saw him not just as a bandmate, but as a teacher. Lennon, alongside McCartney, had helped shape Harrison's early songwriting, even encouraging him to experiment with structure and lyrics. That sense of closeness, however, began to break down as the years passed. As Lennon became increasingly abused in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko, George found himself emotionally shut out. John, who once took pride in his bond with George, grew distant, and unlike McCartney's dominating studio presence, Lennon's not caring cut in a different way. He made fun of Harrison's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality, treating it with sarcasm rather than curiosity. It hurt. George had turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a way to find peace and identity. But from Lennon, he received little more than eye rolls. The true depth of how far apart they'd grown became visible in George's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine. In over 400 pages of personal reflection, George barely mentioned Lennon at all. Fans noticed it wasn't an accident. The silence was a message in itself. Harrison later admitted that John could be a very difficult person and that their final years together were often cold. When Lennon was murdered in December 1980, the shock shook George to his core. But even then, his tribute was not full of nostalgia or sentimentality. Instead, Harrison expressed his grief through music all those years ago, a song that was both tribute and subtle reckoning. It remembered the early bond, yes, but it didn't pretend the pain had never happened. In later interviews, Harrison spoke more softly about Lennon. Age and distance had allowed him to reflect. He acknowledged John's genius and their complicated history, but the emotional scar never really faded. For Harrison, Lennon was someone he had uncephaloed blindly and someone who had later made him feel invisible. That kind of wound doesn't heal easily, even with time. The final years, the final words. As the 1990s came to a close, George Harrison had largely stepped out of the Beatles' shadow, at least in public. He was no longer the guitarist fighting for space on an album. By then, he had become a respected solo artist, a quiet philanthropist, and a spiritual thinker. Yet, despite his peaceful exterior, the emotional leftover stuff from his years with the Beatles still lingered. Harrison rarely talked to booth band unless someone asked. When he did, his tone was dry, thoughtful, and offending with irony. He didn't make past sound romantic. He told the truth, or at least this version of it. In one interview, when asked if he missed being in the Beatles, he replied, "Not with theaters." No, that remark, while funny in the surface, revealed just how deep wounds went. In 1994, George reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Beatles anthology project. It was a media sensation. For the first time since their split, the surviving members were back in the same room working on music together, completing Lennon's unfinished demos, Free Us a Bird, and Real Love. To fans, it was a moment of healing. But insiders saw a different story. Old ways of acting quickly returned. George bristled under Paul's direction. When asked in an interview how it felt to be back in the studio with McCartney, Harrison replied, "It was like going back to school." Producer Jeff Lynne, who had worked with George in the Traveling Wilburys and helped produce the anthology recordings, later remembered how George rolled his eyes whenever Paul got to controlling. McCartney, to his credit, later admitted that the old patterns never really disappeared. "We got on each other's nerves, but we got through it." By 1997, Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. He received radiation treatment and briefly went into remission. But the disease returned, this time in his lungs and brain. During these final years, he lived mostly out of the public eye, spending time with his wife Olivia and son Donnie at their home in Friar Park, a sprawling Victorian estate in Henley-on-Thames. Even in the face of illness, George's wit remained intact. In a 2001 Yahoo Lean chat, one of his last public appearances, he was asked, "Does Paul still annoy you?" George didn't answer directly. Instead, he quoted an old Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was vintage Harrison, philosophical, elegant, but unmistakably pointed. As his condition worsened, Harrison was visited by old friends. One of them was Paul McCartney. The meeting was quiet and personal. Paul later described how they sat together holding hands, a gesture neither would have made in their younger years. "He was my baby brother," Paul said in a 2008 interview. "We joked. We talked about silly things. It was like we were dreaming." Georgia Harrison died on November 29, 2001 at a friend's home in Los Angeles, surrounded by his loved ones. His final words, according to Olivia, were simple: "Love one another." But even in death, the complications of his relationships remained. While Paul grieved publicly and spoke warmly of George in interviews, the unspoken tension between them had never fully disappeared. The forgiveness, if it came, was quiet, incomplete, and perhaps incited. George Harrison left behind a legacy of music, spiritual searching, and quiet rebellion. He had never been the loudest Beatle, but his pain was real, and his silence spoke volumes. Through the decades, there had been admiration, there had been love, but there had also been bitterness. And in the end, there were some people Georgia Harrison simply could never fully forgive.